Today we are talking about how sensory processing impacts communication. We are also going to discuss how to help people understand a child's differences and support children in a neurodiversity affirming way. My guest today is Jessie Ginsburg. She is a sensory integration trained speech-language pathologist, creator of ASD from the Inside Out, and founder of Pediatric Therapy Playhouse, a top-rated speech and language clinic in Los Angeles, California. Through her national publications and talks and her internationally acclaimed Inside Out course, Jessie inspires a new way of thinking about the speech and language pathologist's role in treating young autistic children. Grab a cup of coffee or tea and let's dive into this episode.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Jessie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here too. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, so I'm glad that we're finally allowing it to happen.
The stars have aligned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With between your schedule and my schedule, it's hard to get things on the calendar at a time that works for both of us. I'm really appreciative of you being here.
Yep. And we're right down the street yet.
I know. It has. But we're here now. So thrilled to have you. And, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is because I really wanted to continue a discussion about sensory processing. And I know that this is in your wheelhouse and you see it a lot in the work that you do in your Pediatric Therapy Playhouse practice. And, probably the episode before this one that will air, I had Courtney Duckworth Harris, and she's an occupational therapist.
Yeah, I know her.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
And she introduced the topic of sensory processing for our listeners. And she's an occupational therapist, and you're a speech and language pathologist, but you also work on sensory processing. And I'd love to hear kind of how you became interested in sensory processing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, typically it's, I guess, more widely known that occupational therapists address sensory processing. And for me, especially working with the students that I work with, which are autistic students, most of the time they have a lot of sensory needs. So I really, felt like there was something missing in my practice. And luckily, I was fortunate enough to work at a multidisciplinary clinic where I would work alongside occupational therapists, and we would get to co-treat, meaning we'd be in the same session together with the same child, which was an incredible experience. And I could just so clearly see that when I was implementing those sensory strategies in those sessions, I saw more communication. And, the reason is simple, which is that in order to communicate and use our language in the most effective way possible, we need to be regulated.
Right.
And that's true for kids, that's autistic kids, that's true for adults, it's true for everyone. So it just made complete sense to me that I really needed to understand sensory processing in my own field and in my own work, which is why, I've started training and presenting to other speech therapists on how to integrate sensory strategies into their sessions.
That's so wonderful. And I love that the co-treatment approach because you get that cross-pollination. It seems like you'd have a bigger impact when you are both kind of addressing sensory processing from different perspectives.
Absolutely. It's great for the child. It's great for the therapist too, because we actually get to see each other in our element and we get to learn from each other.
Absolutely. And, so for a parent who's listening and they're thinking about sensory processing and they know their child has sensory processing issues or struggles, what does that look like in terms of its impact on communication? You talked about, regulation is a foundational skill in developing communication, but what does that look like?
So I like to give parents the analogy of, imagine your child has three baskets: language, emotions, and body. And when all of those come together and intersect and our eggs are evenly distributed in the baskets, that's where, communication happens in the most effective way. So imagine your child, you are at Target and your toddler says, "I want goldfish." And what do? You say, "We're not going to get those right now." And before you can finish your explanation, your child has thrown themselves on the floor, crying, screaming. You're very embarrassed. And what do? You start to try to reason with them. "I told you we couldn't get goldfish because I already have some for you. Look, they're right here in our diaper bag. We already have them." But at that point, we've lost them, right? All of their eggs have moved into their emotions basket. There are no more eggs left in their language basket. And there are definitely no eggs left in their body basket. They didn't plan to throw themselves on the floor. They are not thinking of where their body is in space at that moment. They're just focused on what's going on with their emotions. So the only way that we can get that child back to a place where they're regulated and they can access their language and we can actually give them logical explanations and have them understand that is if we can move those eggs back into those baskets and get them to a place where they're regulated again. So I think, it could be for sensory, I put that more in the body realm. So when there's a lot going on in our body, it's hard for us to focus on our language because we're not in a regulated, balanced state where we're optimally aroused. We're either under aroused, over aroused, and we're dysregulated in some sort of way.
Right. And that makes perfect sense. And I'm sure that any parent listening has probably had a similar experience. And, it's hard to reason with a child who can't even access their own thinking skills when they're dysregulated and they're having a tantrum. So you really need to calm the nervous system before you can actually communicate and have them hear you.
Absolutely. And there's really good, and you've probably read it, but for parents, listening, the book, The Whole Brain Child is really great, because it's just explaining to families that when you're having these reflexive automatic responses, which are things that happen in the lower brain, or in that book they call the downstairs brain, they can't even get up to the upstairs brain where the logic happens and the thinking and the creativity and all of those other skills. So for me, it was just so obvious that if we are speech therapists treating the autistic population and report I just read a lot of really great research, but up to 95% of autistic adults report that they feel they have sensory processing differences. So when that large of a percentage of this population is showing that they have sensory processing differences, then to me, it's, it's a clear signal, I guess you could say, to us that this is something that we need to really fully understand.
Absolutely. And I can see how that would look even in a classroom setting when a teacher is trying to communicate with a student, but they're having a difficult time regulating those emotions, filtering those sensory input, and how that can manifest as behavioral problems. And then the teacher believes that the child is just willfully not listening, not following instructions, not communicating appropriately, when in fact there really is a sensory issue that's impacting them.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say that's one of the biggest concerns we'll hear from parents is they'll say, "Oh, well, his teacher called, said he's pushing his peers or he's laying on the ground at circle time." And, so often these things that we're seeing, and I use the word behaviors, meaning something that we observe, not something that's happening in any negative light, but these behaviors are happening because of differences in sensory processing. And when we start to understand that, it all becomes so clear to us. But for me, I really dove deep into trying to learn from the autistic community over the last couple of years. And I have made friends with autistic adults, and it's been life-changing for me to learn from them. And I've tried to attend lots of conferences where there are autistic adults who are the speakers talking about their own sensory needs. So for me, I think that, a lot of us are missing the mark. The autistic population, we finally have social media where people can spread their message and people can, they have a platform for their voices. And unfortunately, it's just a lot of, educators and therapists were not listening. The autistic community is telling us what they want, and we have a really hard time changing our ways that have been ingrained in our heads since we were in graduate school, learning about how to do therapy. But, for anyone listening who isn't familiar with person first language versus identity first language, I wanted to touch on that briefly, because person first language is what is generally drilled into our heads in grad school, which is saying person with autism, the person is a person first, and the autism comes second. Identity first language is saying autistic person, and 97% of the autistic population, adult population, prefers identity first language. And that's because, they say autism is part of who we are. That's something that we should embrace and something we should value, and not something that you want to try to take away from that person. So the other piece of that is that, when we are using identity first language and we're embracing autistic people as what they are, people, not as a disorder or as someone that needs to be fixed. And that's a really big sticking point for people, is that the person with autism needs to be fixed. And what the autistic community is telling us, and there was this amazing quote in a presentation that I went to by Rachel Dorsey, who's an autistic SLP, and she said, there's no neurotypical child under the autism. And I think people will go to such lengths to try to change, tear those layers off and try to find that their child under all of these, quote, behaviors that they're seeing. And the truth is that this is your child, and we need to embrace that child for who they are. And can we work on skills to help them? Absolutely. Can we work on their communication? Yes. Can we help them learn strategies for self-regulating? Yes. But the point is that we need to embrace our kids as they are. And, one of the scary things is that there are a lot of, autistic people who are now voicing their opinion after being in years of therapy where they were trying to be changed so much, and they don't have the opportunity from a young age to develop this positive self-concept. So if we are, using identity first language from the get-go, and we are helping parents to embrace their child for who they are and helping explain these behaviors in a way that makes sense to them, then we are able to help parents love their kids for who they are and, help them develop positive self-concept. Sorry, that was a big soapbox for me.
No, I think that's really important. I think it's really important what you're saying. And I think a lot of parents, a lot of professionals will resonate with what you're saying, because there are definitely differences in the way our graduate programs teach us to do things. And then you get out into the real world and things are different. And I think getting guidance from autistic people is important, because we all want, as professionals and as human beings, to be seen and heard. And we want to be able to develop the skills that'll help us be the best selves that we can be. And we are the ones that have to define what that is for ourselves. And it sounds like what you're saying, when I think about the work that you do in your clinic, that you're not about, when someone comes to see you and brings their child in to see you for speech therapy that also addresses sensory processing, you're not trying to fix them. You're trying to help that child develop skills that'll help them reach their full potential. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to support the family. We're trying to help the family better understand their child so that and help teachers or help parents to help their child's teachers, because, like you pointed out, these are things that come up often in the classroom, so in terms of sensory processing, a lot of these things we might see that look like negative behaviors to us at the surface level are rooted in difficulties with sensory processing. So helping parents to understand, and giving examples, I could give you some of, this is how your child is experiencing the world. And if you experience the world in that way, I bet you would do those things too. Like for the child who is hypersensitive to sound, which is a very common hypersensitivity in autism, saying and maybe this child is the child who is constantly covering their ears or getting really upset when they hear a toilet flush or the hairdryer goes on, or they're trying to escape from their classroom and teachers don't realize it's because it's such a noisy environment. So telling parents things like, imagine if every time you flush the toilet, it sounded like you were in the back of an airplane or standing behind an airplane taking off. How sensory processing works is that how you're seeing kids behave is because that is how their body is experiencing the stimulation. So for a child who's hypersensitive to sound, they are feeling that sound at a greater intensity than other people would typically hear that sound.
Right. And you've described kind of the experience of having like the sensory systems being overloaded and what that can feel like to a person. And so how do you then kind of help parents and professionals understand a child's sensory processing differences like you've described, but do so in a neurodiversity affirming way?
I think that there's really two parts to that question, which is, or two parts to the answer, I guess you could say, because there is how can we support the child by modifying the environment, providing them strategies, helping them learn self-regulation skills. But then there's also the part which is how can we, and I don't have an answer to this, but how can we help make greater institutional changes that allow these kids to be who they are and have it not negatively affect them in class or in the workplace, So for instance, if we have a child who has trouble sitting down at their desk and we want to teach them some self-advocacy skills, something like going to their teacher and saying, I really feel like I need to move around right now. Do you mind if I stand in the back of the class instead of sit at my desk? That is only going to work if we have a teacher who says, of course, go ahead. Right. But unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet in a place where, so there's, big changes to be made on all fronts.
Absolutely. And I think there is a movement, and I think we've realized, we're recording this at the tail end of what I hope is the tail end of a pandemic. But I know that I think educators have really had a chance to kind of think about the way that they're doing things, and they've had to be flexible during this time. And I'm hoping that that flexibility will continue as we transition back to in-person learning, and that educators would be more open to things like you're describing, because I think that can only benefit everyone. Yeah,
that's a really good point. And let's hope the flexibility in education continues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's the education system, and it's the way we view differences, in the classroom and in behaviors that we see and how we interpret it. And parents also can do a lot. Now, you talked about self-advocacy, and I think that's just such an important skill for, kids, for adults who think differently, learn differently, experience the world differently, to really learn to advocate for what it is that they need. And I think that we often don't spend enough time helping them develop that skill. And it's so important for life, because they need to be able to express to others what it is that they need so that they can get their needs met in a way that works for them. And so I know that you do work in your clinic and your team does, really great work, but what can parents also do at home to kind of support the work that you're doing, in the clinic?
Yeah, I think that something that's definitely worth mentioning. And, I know you have kids, I have 3 kids, and this is a reminder. It's one of those things where sometimes it's easier to give parenting advice and harder to take it.
Absolutely. All the time.
Yeah. I'm constantly reminding myself of this. But something that's really important that parents can easily think about is when they're seeing something happening with their child, like they're seeing some type of behavior or the child is dysregulated, trying to figure out if it's fair to expect their child to self-regulate in that moment, or if we really need to step in as this nurturing person in their life and help them co-regulate. And a lot of the kids in the clinic here, and, for a lot of kids who are younger, 5 and under, I would say, they're really still in this place where a lot of behaviors are coming out of more automatic reflexive responses. They're not planned, manipulative, purposeful behaviors. So if behaviors are happening out of, a reflex, then that's generally something that we need to address with co-regulation. We really need to help that child because self-regulation requires, a lot of being able to logically think through the problem and then think flexibly through what solutions could be and then implement that. And when a child is having a behavior that's something more automatic, like thinking of the goldfish crying on the floor example, that's an automatic reaction. And the answer to that is not telling the child, here, why don't you eat these goldfish in the diaper bag? The response to that needs to be more of something where we're going to co-regulate with the child and really try to help them calm down and get to a place before then introducing that logical thought. So I think like one of the things that really ties in well to helping parents understand their child's sensory needs and how their child is experiencing the world. And one of the most powerful things we could do as parents and professionals is validate our kids. And there's another great thing Rachel Dorsey said that I loved so much. I had posted, but she said, how are autistic adults supposed to know what's good or bad for their own bodies when they've had a lifetime of being invalidated?
Mm.
And, think of how often you tell your child, oh, no, it's not cold outside. Oh, that food isn't too hot. That sweater's not itchy. Those lights aren't too bright. That classroom's not too loud. So, people don't function that way. When we're invalidated, we are not then receptive to listening to a person. What we need is someone who is nurturing and warm and supportive and really validating the way that we feel, because that's the only way that we're going to then open up and trust that person.
Right. And that when people don't have their feelings validated, that it can also increase their anxiety level, which can further contribute to those difficulties with regulating your emotions. Because again, you're not being understood. Your feeling is you're not being understood. And when you talk about that co-regulation, and I love that you kind of distinguish between the co-regulation and self-regulation, because a lot of young kids haven't learned to self-regulate yet. And so through that co-regulation, one, you're modeling self-regulation, but you're also making a connection with your child at that time. And we know how important it is to connect. And having both of those things happen can then help the child move from a place of co-regulation to self-regulation. But oftentimes those big responses or those big behaviors, or that, that lower brain is telling the world that they need something, that something is not right. Something doesn't feel right. You're not understanding me. You're not hearing me. There's something that I need that you're not giving me. And oftentimes we need to connect and listen as well so that we know how to provide the appropriate level of support.
Absolutely. And that's honestly the hardest part, because energy is contagious. And when you're with your child who's having a really hard time, before you know it, you're really stressed and frustrated too. So it's very counterintuitive, because we really have to remind ourselves that instead of getting to that place, we really need to be there as more of a calming source for that child. And, like you said, build a connection in order to be someone the child can trust and will open up to.
A lot of the work that you do and a lot of the work that I do and we do is really listening and hearing from families what it is that they need. And in our work, we have to take into consideration their beliefs, their values, their cultural background, what they need into consideration, whether we're doing evaluations or we're implementing, supportive treatment plans. And you just have this beautiful way of connecting with people. And I can see through your approach that you really allow families, which I often say on this podcast, to be seen and heard. And that is such a validating thing for so many families.
Yeah, it's just as important for anyone. It's, that's not something we grow out of. We all need that.
That's a human need. That's a human need. So, Jessie, thank you so much for all the work that you do. I think it's just so important. I loved having you here today to kind of give a different perspective to the experience that many of the people that we work with, deal with and express, and what it is that they need. And it really seems that, you've gone above and beyond your educational training, your graduate school training, and your clinical experience to really connect with autistic people and to see what it is that they need. And that's really informed the work that you do. And I think it really speaks a lot to the level of work and the kind of support that you provide to so many families.
Thank you. That's so nice. Yeah, I'm really hoping that I can use my platform to, amplify autistic voices. And I'm really excited. I just found out that I've got an autistic SLP and autistic OT who will be guests in my upcoming course, which is for speech pathologists. But I'm really excited to be able to, share their messages, and because we all need to be listening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
I would say on Instagram, which is Jessie Ginsburg.SLP. I'm also on Facebook, and my website is called asdfromtheinsideout.com.
All right. And I'm going to make sure that we put links to all of those in the show notes, and also a link to your course too. So I think that's going to be important for other SLPs who may want to learn from you.
Awesome. Amazing.
Thank you so much for being here today, Jessie. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Make sure to check out the show notes to learn more about Jessie and the incredible work she is doing. And DM me on Instagram at Child Nexus Community to let me know what you thought about this episode. And if you like what you're hearing on this podcast, join our community on childnexus.com. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.